In our last unit, we saw that through the development of industrialization and urbanization in the United States, that many different social, economic, or political injustices occurred during that period of time. Now, where do you think conditions like these were found? That's the question. Well, what we are going to see is that they were typically found in overpopulated urban areas. As you can see from this slideshow, which shows a lot of social problems, by the turn of the 20th century, many American cities have become crowded and had large, poor populations. The image that you're looking at right now shows a group of people on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. So each of these photographs represents an important social, economic, or political issue that was relevant in America at the turn of the century. So, what sort of social problems can you identify in these images? Well, in this one, we see a lot of overcrowding. We see a lot of poverty. Here, in the early 1900s, many people worked in unsafe factories or mills. This image shows the fire on March 25, 1911 at the Ash Building where the Triangle Shirtwaist Company had its factory, and many young women died in that fire. This shows, again, unsafe working conditions that existed at that time. It was also common for children to work long hours at unsafe jobs in factories. This photo shows two young boys working on the spinning machine at the Bibb Cotton Mill in Macon, Georgia in 1909. This shows both unsafe working conditions and the problem of child labor. So again, where do you think conditions like this were found? Well, they were found in urban, overpopulated areas. And all of these images show the need for reform at the local, state, and national levels. Now the question is, why might it be difficult for the people in these photographs to effect change on their own behalf? Well, first, they had no political voice. Women couldn't vote. Children couldn't vote or speak out. And the poor were kept off to the sides. They were marginalized and they were manipulated by those in power. So, in this unit, we're going to see what people who eventually called themselves progressives did to try to solve many of these problems and improve the conditions that we saw represented by these pictures.
So as we begin our study of progressivism, the first thing I would recommend that you do is to go to the Schoology page for this unit and this lesson and download and print out a copy of the guided notes activity entitled The Rise of Progressivism. You may wish to pause the video right now to be able to do that. As you go through this video lesson, you can take notes on the different topics that we will be covering throughout the video lesson. The first group of people that we're going to study are people that we call muckrakers, and they are represented in this political cartoon that you see in front of you. So the first question is, well, who are the muckrakers and what do they have to do with reform and progressivism at the time? First, here's a definition. A muckraker is someone who reveals bad or corrupt behavior by a person or a business. So they're investigating. They're trying to find out who's doing things wrong and then revealing them to the public, either through photos or stories that they might do in magazines or newspapers. The person on the left in this cartoon is a muckraking journalist who is trying to expose and reform corporate corruption. His sign is telling the man on the right not to take money from big businesses. The man on the right is a worker. He is dressed in workman's clothing and wearing a working man's cap. The man is holding a dinner pail. People used to bring their lunches to work in metal pails such as this one. The text on the pail reads, "The full dinner pail is good enough for me." The cartoon is saying that the worker does not care about corruption or breaking up trusts and monopolies. He simply wants a job that will pay him enough to eat. So the question for you is, do you think this cartoon is on the side of business or on the side of the muckraker? Muckraker journalists took varied approaches. They didn't all expose corruption in the same way. Some journalists promoted progressive ideals in their writing. They wrote newspaper articles and magazine articles. Some published photos of the problems in magazines or newspapers. But they were called investigative journalists because they were investigating wrongdoing, and they examined various social conditions and political corruption, exposing the negatives that they observed. Some muckrakers concentrated on exposing injustice within large corporations. Others uncovered government and social problems. And they tried to increase public awareness of these problems, which motivated reform movements. Now, a question for you would be, how do you think business leaders, politicians, and tenement owners felt about the muckrakers? Well, as you can imagine, they disliked the muckrakers for calling attention to the problems they had caused. Why do you think the muckrakers' reporting style was so popular? Well, because people have always been interested in reading about crime, scandal, and corruption. We like to read about it and watch it on TV even today. It makes for very interesting stories, even though we think the things we're watching or reading about are wrong. Also, some were probably glad to see that their problems were finally being addressed. So muckrakers are people who investigated social problems. And this was very different from being a news reporter or an author, because they were probably trying to report things objectively. Now, where might you find investigative reports now? Well, we find them in magazines, we find them in the newspaper, we watch them on TV, cable and satellite television stories. Modern-day journalists still cover stories similar to those dealt with by the muckrakers. Today, modern-day journalists still do stories about crime, about corruption in government, and bad social conditions.
So now we'll continue to focus on some of the roots of the progressive movement and look at how progressives hope to make government more efficient and responsive to citizens. So this is our first lesson on the roots of progressivism. We're going to look at several essential questions in this lesson. The first one we've already talked a lot about, and that is, who were the progressives and what did they believe caused social problems? The second question that you should understand by the time we get done with this lesson is, how did the progressives hope to make government more efficient and responsive to citizens? And finally, the third question, why did the progressives support the women's suffrage movement? One particular response to the problems of the day. So let's begin by looking at social problems that existed at the time and some of the solutions the progressives proposed to solve those problems. Here are some facts to consider. In 1890, more than 90% of the nation's 12 million families earned less than $1,200 per year. The average annual income was $380, which was below the poverty line. Many of those were working class families. About 40% of those families lived on less than $400 a year, and most family members worked. The modern poverty line in the United States is about $10,830 for a single person, while the average income right now is about $50,000 per household. Progressives also pushed for child labor laws, minimum wages, and maximum working hours. Worker safety was another vital issue that resulted in new safety standards for businesses. Many progressives also worked to prohibit the sale and use of alcohol because they believed it was responsible for much of the poverty that they saw, the crime that they saw, and domestic violence that was occurring at the time. In particular, women were at the forefront of the prohibition movement to prohibit the manufacture, sale, and use of alcohol. And an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, was the flagship organization of the cause. By 1911, the WCTU had more than 250,000 members. They, and other like-minded organizations, promoted prohibition of alcohol with the eventual passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, which for 12 years banned the manufacture, sale, or consumption of all alcoholic beverages in the United States. Progressives also developed two proposals in which experts would run city government. Instead of giving government jobs to people who were unqualified, friends and family members who were being bribed by political machines of the day, they wanted city government to run more professionally and to bring in experts to run city programs. So they developed these two proposals. One was called a commission plan and the other was called a council manager system. And these would be forms of government where experts would be brought in to run different particular city programs. Another way they wanted to clean up government and to bring more democracy to government and to get rid of the political machines was through the use of three different types of reforms. One called the initiative, another called the referendum, and the other called the recall. These were the focuses of the Progressives' political agenda. To eliminate corruption in the U.S. Senate, for example, Progressives called for a direct election of senators by each state's voters rather than having senators elected by state legislatures as they were at the time. So, what is the referendum? What is the initiative? What is the recall? Let's discuss these terms a little bit. The initiative is when a group of citizens wants the legislature to vote on a new littering law. That would be an example of an initiative. And so people would circulate a petition, get signatures on the petition, and if they got enough signatures, that would be put to a vote of the people on the ballot. The referendum is when a group of citizens wants to vote directly on whether or not to increase school funding. So they petition to put that on the ballot. And a recall is when a group of citizens wishes to remove the mayor from office or some other elected official from office. Political power before and during the Progressive era was not regulated the way it is today. Can you think of any recent incidents of corruption at the local, state, or national level? There are plenty of examples out there for you to think of. The situation at the turn of the 20th century was actually considerably worse, and examples of corruption ran through every level of government. So which issue caused progressives to look to government to regulate social behavior? Well, that would be the sale and use of alcohol. And why do you think progressives wanted to change the management of local governments? Well, that is because cities were rife with corruption, disease, and poverty at that time. Many of the social issues that concerned progressives were directly tied to urban problems.
Next, we are going to talk about the women's suffrage movement, which is the movement to give women the right to vote. And let me give you a little bit of background information on this before we take a look at a map of where the partial women's suffrage existed even before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. One group you should be familiar with is the National Women's Suffrage Association, or the NSSA. They wanted a constitutional amendment to secure women's voting rights. But there were other groups that were similar to and fighting for similar goals. One of those was the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. They combined their efforts with the NSSA in 1890. There was also a political party dedicated to women's suffrage called the NWP, the National Women's Party. It was formed because Alice Paul, one of the leaders in the women's suffrage movement, wanted to directly confront President Wilson on suffrage and push the movement even further. And of course, we have a definition for what suffrage is. Suffrage is the right to vote. And ultimately, women across the country won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. That was ratified on August 26, 1920.
Now, while you might be tempted to believe that no women could vote in the United States until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, that wasn't true. Partial women's suffrage actually existed in the United States prior to 1920. There were certain states that had granted women the right to vote. Oftentimes, it was because they wanted to lure women to those states to increase that state's population so that they could gain more representation in the House of Representatives. And many of these states were located out west. So let's take a look at a map of where women's suffrage actually existed prior to 1920. The states that you see in purple are states that had granted women suffrage before 1920, complete women's suffrage. And one thing that you'll notice is that most of these states were located out here in the west. Wyoming, our neighbor to the north, actually was the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1869. But other western states soon followed. Colorado granted women the right to vote in 1893, and you can see that there were only two states further east, New York in 1917 and Michigan in 1918, that had granted women the right to vote prior to 1920, and even those two states were fairly late to the game. Most of these other western states had granted women the right to vote at an earlier time. The states in green granted women partial women's suffrage. Well, what does that mean? That meant that they could vote in certain elections, like representatives for U.S. Senate or the House of Representatives, but maybe not in state and local elections. So women did not have the full right to vote in these states, but they did have the partial right to vote, meaning they could vote in some elections. But again, most of these were states in the Midwest. If we look at the states in yellow, most of them in the South, these were states that had granted no women's suffrage until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Now, as more states granted women's suffrage, Congress began favoring a constitutional amendment. After passage through the House and a year later by the Senate, the bill went to the states. And as we said, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. But many of these suffrage groups that we looked at previously were trying to develop a state-by-state approach. Instead of pushing for a constitutional amendment, which is very difficult to get because it requires two-thirds passage by Congress and then approval by three-quarters of the states, they tried a state-by-state approach. And they thought there was an advantage to this because they could hope to convince people a little at a time, and then they gained momentum rather than seeking a national consensus at a time they knew they did not have one. This is an advantage of our federal system. If you don't think you can get a law passed nationally or a constitutional amendment passed nationally, maybe you can try to get something adopted one state at a time. And as you gain momentum and as it gains popularity, then you can have national success. Additionally, these women might hope to show the nation how responsible and effective women voters could be, stopping fears that others might have. So what trends do you notice about this map? Well, the West and the Midwest were very supportive of women's suffrage, as we've talked about. The East Coast and the South tended to oppose suffrage. So what reason can you offer for the trends that you notice on the map? Well, we can give some different answers to this. Eastern and Southern states tended to hold on to long-standing traditional beliefs and were more conservative. Those beliefs had been passed down through generations, and people were slow to change their minds about whether or not women should be able to vote. People who moved west had an unconventional streak about them. Women on the frontier were given more of the day-to-day responsibilities, thus earning a more prominent role in society. The West also had more women with land and property. Thus they felt that they would deserve the right to vote because they had ownership rights. Now, as we conclude our study of suffrage, don't confuse the word suffrage with the word suffer. When you see suffrage, you might think, well, suffer is in that, and so suffrage is pain felt by women. That's not true at all. Suffrage means the right to vote. The word suffrage actually derives from the Latin word suffragium, which means to vote. So suffrage refers to the right to vote.